Hey, everybody. Welcome to An Attorney and an Accountant Walk Into a Bar. I'm John. I'm the attorney, and my buddy here.
I'm Kent, and I'm the accountant.
Hey, what are we talking about today, Kent?
It's the landlord's dilemma, specifically in California.
Let's get into it.
Kind of need a real drink, John. I'll be quite honest. You know,
Well, when it comes to the landlord, especially when it comes to evictions in the state of California, and more particularly the city of Los Angeles, or for that matter, San Francisco, Berkeley, these places, the regulatory landscape has gotten to be quite complicated. And it's very difficult for a landlord to evict people, especially without, professional help.
I find that it is so onerous for a landlord to even. It's almost if it's a privilege to provide housing to someone else. And the fact that they pay you is a privilege to the landlord, that they actually, in fact, get paid for providing housing. There's been a lot of movements for just abolish rent.
Well, that seems to be the position of our legislature and, more particularly our city councils and places like that in California have become particularly sensitive, so we say, to tenants' rights without thinking a lot about landlords' rights. And it's not, most people think of that in terms of RSO, or rent stabilization ordinance, is more commonly referred to as rent control. Oftentimes they'll consider rent control to be the problem. Oh, rent control, I'm not getting enough rent. Well, really, rent control, even though it's a pain, is probably less of an issue for evicting people and just keeping your cash flow going than the just cause ordinances, which are in place now, which are really much worse because, rent control, there is, there has to be an allowance for a reasonable return. There's ways to petition to raise the rent. There's always a certain amount you can raise it each year, except during COVID and things like that.
So what's it like on your side as an attorney working with landlords? So from an accountant, I see potential reductions in cap rate. I see, some modifications in terms of the ability for folks to depreciate various assets. I see that lowered market rents, potential lowered market rents, or non-payment of rents during the eviction process, really affecting cap rates on multi-units. And now I'm not even talking about the large Avalon complexes with hundreds of units. Really, I feel like the devastation is happening on the bulk of, we'll call it, the middle management of 2 to 4 units, 2 to 6 units, mom and pa owned units, either inherited units, and it has a devastating effect, at least from an accounting standpoint. What are you seeing on the law side?
Well, I mean, the effect on the accounting side is a consequence of the law side, which is our inability or to evict tenants. I mean, vacancy and collection losses used to run, I don't know, you tell me, 4 or 5% was usually what you baked into, appraisals. I've seen vacancy and collection losses as high as 25 and 30%, especially, like to your point, on the mom and pop operations, because if you got 4 units and you have one tenant that's not paying, that's a 25% loss,
Absolutely.
right? Or potentially more if it's one of the bigger units. So one non-paying unit can just destroy the cash flow on a smaller unit, and if you get 2 of them and they're not doing it, well, you probably can't even make your mortgage at that point. So really, really heavy impact. And again, so there was all the COVID stuff, right, where you couldn't evict people and people didn't have to pay their rent, and then they'd have to get caught up on it later. That's pretty much over for the large part. It still has some effect on calculating rent for 3 days and things like that, but it's pretty well. We're in an environment now where we can evict people if they don't pay rent. The problem is that eviction process has gotten to be so complicated, and it's so easy to just make one tiny mistake and get set behind months.
So you're saying that in the now times, right, the post-COVID times, that if someone doesn't pay rent, that is now justification to actually evict an individual. And is that different between LA County, I think places outside LA County? How does that quite differ?
Well, it doesn't differ a lot in terms of ability between counties. If someone's not paying their rent, uh, you really can't. So one of the nice things about California, one of the pluses is that local governments can't interfere with the summary nature of unlawful detainer. So as much as they'd like to, they can't stop you from evicting someone if they're not paying rent. But what they do is they make the notice procedure and the eviction procedure so complicated that many tenants, let's so we say, slip through the net, right? They slip through the process. So you end up with taking months and months and months and months, sometimes years, to evict someone because they're able to play fast and loose with, the
Is it just procedure, civil
it's
procedure?
it's all procedure. Yeah, and
Wow.
it all starts with a 3-day notice, right? If you don't get that 3-day notice right, you make one tiny mistake in it.
Yeah.
Let's say, I'll give you an example. One of the requirements in a 3-day notice now is that you have to provide the address and account number for a bank where the rent can be deposited that's within 5 miles of the tenancy.
Wow. That seems very, very specific.
It's very specific, and it raises all kinds of questions, right? What if you're trying to evict someone that's out in the country and there isn't any bank for 5 miles? What if what if your bank account for your landlord isn't, what if you're at, Farmers or Merchants Bank and you don't have an account that's near
Sure.
where the tenancy is? It doesn't give you any allowances for that. So, and I have to tell you, most 3-day notices that I've seen that landlords are using from forms and things like that don't have that stuff in it.
It's not, I guess it shouldn't be surprising. The same lawmakers that are writing tax code are some of the same lawmakers making these rental and landlord rules or rental rules in LA County. And we find in a lot of these, call it quickly thrown together statutes to be having a lot of holes in it that honestly require some level of litigation in order to gain clarity on its use or purpose, and therefore having iterations to clarify what actually is the use case, or how do you follow the letter of the law, right? There's a letter in the spirit of the law, and the idea is that the landlord ends up feeling in Los Angeles or California that why be a landlord? And I want to dispel the myth that there's these large corporations renting out and they're profiting anyways because they have 200-300 units, in this building. So their rent's too high, which is another topic altogether, the cost of living in the state that we're in. But I think people don't realize that, providing housing, smaller landlords, that is a way of making a living. And they truly provide housing, they upkeep a property, and that's how they make a living. The reduction of essentially their income is a direct relation for them to pay their mortgage and provide for their families.
Right, and rent control and the price of rent, and that's a whole nother discussion. I mean, that isn't even one that hits me as a lawyer, because by the time it gets to me, I don't know what, the rent control and what you're charging for rent and market rent's sort of irrelevant, right? I'm at the point where, well, the tenant's not paying, or the tenant is damaging the property, or the tenant is doing illegal activities at the property, or they're harassing the other tenants, and or otherwise causing a nuisance, and they need to be evicted. And that's not always just about money, right? Sometimes that's about protecting the other tenants in the building or protecting the management of the building. And that process has gotten crazy. I mean, I'll give you a great example. This is one that just drives me crazy, is when it comes to Section 8 stuff. There's actually, to evict someone in Section 8 housing, whether or not it's a 3-day notice or a 30-day notice that you have to use, is ambiguous to the point where no one really knows. And here's why. Part of the COVID tenant relief stuff that the federal government did provided that the Secretary of Housing could invoke an emergency order that required, at least in federally subsidized housing, that you would have to evict on 30 days notice, not 3 days, for non-payment of rent.
Okay.
For good or better or worse, I mean, at the time of the emergency, I guess you could say that made sense, because you wouldn't want, throwing people out because they couldn't pay rent, and that people didn't have money, and
Sure,
all this
we were in a
all this-
pandemic.
yeah, all
Get
this
it.
crazy stuff. So now we're past that, right?
Right.
So most people would assume, well, President Biden has rescinded the emergency order, and therefore it's a 3-day notice again. No one really knows because the Secretary of Housing never rescinded the order. The order is still there.
Oh.
So you would have to argue, well, the emergency powers went away, but we don't know. We really just don't know. So for safety's sake, at least for my landlords, when we're doing Section 8, I just go with 30 days.
Okay. But that extends that timeline. It extends the timeline of non-payment,
Yep.
extends, and it goes into accounting where we're seeing a large reduction of revenue. It's similar to stores, retail stores. It's just a corollary where we have the zero bail policy, for example, in LA County. So stores are seeing a lot of shrinkage or a lot of theft that's at scale is causing a massive dent and causing a lot of stores in the West Coast to just to shut down, right? To close up shop, to decide that it's no longer viable to do business. And that's similarly, but less spoken about, related to landlords, that there's landlords when we're looking at the economics and we're doing the tax work and we're saying, why be a landlord in California? Because the rules that are in place don't provide protections to the landlord in order for them to run a viable business, to provide housing and provide good housing. And we're not talking about being slumlords. We're talking about folks that want to maintain and care for their properties. And guess what? The cost of materials for building, the cost of hiring labor to maintain those buildings has all gone up. And at scale, what that does is it increases the cost to provide good housing. And therefore, the cost of housing is rising concurrently. And this is just, I think, the economic, economic environment we're in with inflation coming up. That's the norm. But it's hit, I think, the West Coast predominantly in a larger sense because on the East Coast, the cost of living, and on the West Coast, the cost of living is generally higher. So we get to see amplified effects, right? I think it's similarly happening across the country, but we're seeing it here amplified because the cost of living next to the ocean and the premium for that causes, this stratification where we're seeing, oh wow, one rental unit being off the market or no longer being rentable because it's going through an eviction process causes a pretty significant, by percentage, devastating effect to the landlord.
And I think you and I both know, in fact, we have a mutual client who has decided that they're getting out of the rent business at least in LA City, for sure, if not California altogether. And I think the other interesting place that you and I see this, since we've had a lot of real estate investments for our wealthy family groups, the capitalization rates outside the state of California are really good. And the ones inside the state of California stink. And you can kind of just look at it. In fact, when we're analyzing real estate investments, we look at it and say, it's a 4 cap. Oh, that's in LA. Well, that's not bad.
Yeah, no,
But we're looking at stuff in Arizona that's a 12 cap, right?
But there's lessons along each way because the trade-off in California is the equity value of the property over time. I've had an instance where two clients, kind of like a tale of two cities here, where one client had a significant portion of investment in the South Bay, and they had smaller units, maybe like 15 to 22 to 4 units. And at some point, it was self-managed, called it the Ma and Pa setup. And it just became a lot of work. Instead of having a management company, they did it on their own, it was admirable. But at some point, they said, you know what, let's consolidate. We're going to sell those things, move into another state, in this case, in the area of like Virginia or Maryland kind of area. And they bought, solid anchored triple nets, to Walgreens, to Rite Aids. And they gave, at the time, similar cap rates. But what had happened was, in that terminology, is that move on 5 to 6 years. 5 to 6 years on, the value of that property in South Bay grew exponentially versus the value of the triple nets, the commercial triple nets they had in other states, anchored by great cash flowing tenants. With scaled premiums year over year, the COLA adjustments. So had they just maintained the same properties in California, they would probably have doubled or tripled their overall net worth.
Well, yeah. I mean, that's certainly why California continues to be the draw, because if the capitalization rates stayed where they are, then all the money would flee California. So clearly the money that's being spent here, and the reason you still buy here is because we're hoping for that appreciation. But, that's unknown.
Yeah, but everyone always asks this: is there a limit? Because if you asked, if you asked me some 10 plus years ago, 15 years ago, what $1 million gets you, and you're like, that's really expensive. $1 million house, $2 million house, and in California these days, that $1 million mark doesn't actually go very far in terms of square footage, location, and that seems insane. But they go, is there a limit? And the Californians sometimes look to New York and they say, hey, that penthouse is going for 12, 15, 20, 30, 40 million dollars. Is there a limit in New York City? And the answer is probably dependent on the economy and inflation and a lot of other general things. But what is disturbing is that it also creates a socioeconomic divide across, the American strata, right? The socioeconomic divide starts to entice those with the highest economic means to be in areas of concentration that are very expensive to live, but all those individuals require infrastructure. So those folks that are part of the service infrastructure for meals, for transportation, for all that, and those people all have to live in community. The question is, is it going to be like like we see in the movies where the wealthy live in these above the cloud high rises, and all of a sudden all the paupers, the service folks, it includes you and I, we're professional service individuals, living in the offshoots, just living on scraps.
Well, that certainly seems to be where we're headed, and that is certainly what you hear a lot of people talking about is, the rich are becoming richer and the poor are becoming poorer. And that, I think, is especially acute here in California when you consider the fact that people are leaving the state. I mean, we do have a net loss in population, which is undeniable. And, it's obvious where people are going. They're going to Texas. They're going to Idaho. They're going to Tennessee is another place I've seen people go. And it almost always boils down to the cost of housing. It really does. I mean, you hear people, they'll spew things about their politics, but I really don't think that's the main driving force, because the first thing you hear from people who move to, say, Texas or Idaho, and I, certainly personally have a lot of experience with that, is, oh my God, it's so cheap here. Not, oh my God, there's people that believe in that hate abortion like I do. That's not what you hear them talk about. You don't hear them say how great it is that I'm with other, like-minded conservatives.
Yeah.
What you hear is, oh my God, my taxes are less. Oh my God, my insurance is less. The water bill's like nothing. That's what you hear.
Isn't that, I would say that, isn't that attributable to the newness of the geographic region? So if you think about, the idea of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, they got safety and housing, so they're focused on that. And the longer they stay in that region, though, then they get comfortable with that strata. They start to escalate, right? They go over that more intellectual needs that need to be satisfied, political desires, things like that. And so I think over time,
I think that's probably true. But I'm saying is it's just, I think that if all other things being equal, there would be less people leaving California if the economic situation in other states were the same.
Oh, regardless of the
right. So if it was the same price for a house and insurance and fuel and every other expense you could think of was the same as Southern California and say Austin, not sure too many people would be going to Austin.
Regardless of politics is what you're saying, right?
Right.
Got it.
That's
well, we have proven that, San Francisco, for example, could clean up the streets. We just need visits by more foreign diplomats to shame us into.
You were going to say Chinese dictators.
No, you know what? I'll call it respected foreign diplomats.
There you go.
Of any country to visit. I think it's less the country itself, but we'll call it the shame And I have friends whose significant others make them clean their houses before the cleaner comes over or their housekeeper comes over because they're so ashamed about how untidy their home is. It's a similar philosophy I feel like some of these politicians are using to be like, hey, our streets, they're terrible. And I don't want another country to think that we're terrible. But the whole point is that you have to live there. And that goes back to, landlords and tenants, especially in the role that we play with a lot of our clients. There's a growing interesting dynamic. I've been an advocate with the landlords we work with to be incredibly selective on who they lease their properties to. It used to be, okay, you got a good credit report, the pay stub is good, you seem like a fine individual, let's rent to you, we're good. Right? And then there's laws in place, rules in place that allow that transaction to be a little bit more seamless, less high touch. Now it's a matter of, all right, will they mesh with the other tenants? Who else is in the building? What are their personal habits? And not only who are they, but who do they consort with? And do we think that during hard times they're respectful of the property, their neighbors, and also will they pay their rent when things get tough? Right? I've had landlords that are very selective, and even during the pandemic, sent out proper notices, let them all know to say, hey, if there's a problem, please, before you go and get assistance, talk to me as a landlord, and let's talk about it. And because this individual had a great set of tenants and spent a lot of time arduously picking through who they wanted to place in this community that they were building, it panned out very, very well. Other landlords who are just renting to whoever. And there's different styles of folks. We call it student housing, regular housing, and people of different socioeconomic strata. Without that community, like that key part is community, that it doesn't go very well. Because I think it's easy for people to, I guess the term is just to screw over someone you don't know, right? You don't have a connection to.
Right. And the really, I think, potentially ugly part of that, because I've seen in my practice, I've seen a lot of landlords who are very frustrated now and frankly angry. And a lot of the comment I hear is, I'm going to really be more selective in my tenants. Mm-hmm. And I wish that just meant they wanted to make sure they had the money. Because I think there's a hint of racism there. And I think the way that comes out is not that someone is absolutely saying, well, I'm not going to rent to X group because I think they're bums. I think what it boils down to is, to your exact point, I trust people who are more like me. I trust people who look like me. Mm-hmm. I trust people who think like me. And now that I've been burned, and I'm angry, and I, lost all this money, I'm going to want to rent someone who looks like me. And that doesn't necessarily mean, you're not renting to, Hispanics or blacks. It could mean that maybe an Indian person's going to be more inclined to rent to an Indian family, and it could mean the awful scourge of racism of whites only renting to whites.
But
that's a possibility.
Could that be just the level of better cultural understanding, right? Because then you have Americans born in America renting in America, and there's different stratas of race, religion, and color, that are a part of that. But then there's that other subsection of folks that are immigrants to America, and that also has, I think, a different social stratification. We even have a client that prefers folks that are newer to America, and while most landlords would shy away from them, they because they have some immigrant history, they realize that these groups of immigrants, from where they came from, the trials and tribulations it took to get to where they're at now, even though they're not of high socioeconomic status, have a level of integrity that is prevalent through that culture, and it's important for them.
Here's the problem with that statement, though, Ken. Remember that the prohibition on discrimination in housing is race, religion, national origin. Mm-hmm. So even if you're discriminating in favor of an immigrant family who may have immigrated from some place that you also immigrated from, or that you see, something in their culture, that's prohibited. You can't discriminate on those things. The only thing landlords should be looking at when they look at whether or not they're going to accept a tenant is what's their credit score like? Have they been evicted before? You know, do they have the income to pay the rent? Not how they look,
Yep.
not how they smell, none of these things. You know, I had a landlord, talk to me the other day, and he was saying, one of the things I do is I look at their car, and I look at if their car's messy or not inside. Well, I guess you could discriminate on that. I told him I was uncomfortable with it, but okay, that's not race, religion, national origin, and now we have to add to that, of course, gender preferences and sexual orientation, but that's, I don't think that's either here nor there. It's, is their car messy? Well, okay.
I mean,
I'll give them that one. But,
I guess
but beyond that, it's really just supposed to be the numbers.
Yeah. The other thing is when you talk about personal hygiene in that example, I do think it's important because how they care for their own personal property could be a relative gauge of how they care for your property. Another thing that I've seen or read about as well too is people love to understand, and they always ask a poll of a crowd, when you're leaving a parking lot and you have your cart. If the cart return is way down there, what do you do with it? How many people shove it on the sidewalk? And how many people empty the cart and run it back? So
I shove it on the sidewalk.
So
my wife runs it back.
I'm one of the ones where I like to do the skating of the cart, where you run really fast and you jump on it and let it let it take you. But you put it back. But the idea is that it's indicative of when no one is watching, what is the individual's proclivity. And that speaks to how they maintain their household. It speaks to how they maintain or comport themselves, which is important these days for a landlord, because that same behavior is going to be the foundation how they react when things get bad. Because I don't think many people intend to lease a place and then lose a job, or lease a place and lose their spouse and lose income. But things happen, right, in life. And when that does happen, you look at the behavioral indicators that are underlying. And I think that's a true indicator. Now, if landlords have the opportunity to do that, I think that's very valuable, regardless of of looking at income level. Honestly, if there's someone that is a diligent worker and has incredible, in my personal opinion, incredible personal fortitude, right, and has incredible integrity, they may be a better candidate to live in the community than someone that is, has tons of income and can easily make all the payments, but is rather flippant and disrespectful of not only the rules of the property or the other neighbors.
I think those are very good points, but I would have to honestly say, if I were counseling you as a landlord and you were thinking about using those things, that it's really, really easy to cross over into applying race there.
Yeah.
And I would be remiss to not tell you as your lawyer that stick to the numbers, man. Don't get into people's appearance, because how do you know that what you're really filtering is, their personal appearance and hygiene or their race? Mm-hmm. It's a really tough line, and it's a mental line, and it's inside. And personally, as a lawyer, I don't like it. I think it has to be really, really just purely objective.
Sure. So what is the advice then? So we're in this environment as it is now. Could it change? Obviously. Could it change for the better? Sure. Could it change for the worse, become more restrictive? Of course it can. But what is the advice to call it California-based landlord that's saying, hey, I either currently have property or I want to buy more property because housing is the career I've chosen? What's the advice there? What are the pitfalls that they might need to avoid?
Well, the biggest piece of advice, I think, is that you have to understand that having a good outcome for a bad situation when it comes to rentals is having a good lease agreement to start with. And most landlords use form lease agreements or car forms that are, for want of a better word, garbage. They don't work at all. There's a lot of things that you can put into a lease agreement that are going to help you evict someone for cause now, that we have to have cause, And if you don't have the things in the lease agreement, you're going to have a lot of avenues foreclosed to you. So good lease agreement, good procedures in place for your management to make sure that you are giving the proper notices, that you're posting the things that you're supposed to post, you're giving the 3-day notices, you're calculating the 3-day notices correctly, and then having a good legal team that you can go to do the deed when the time comes to get rid of the tenant.
Man, John, it just seems like the average landlord really needs to engage with a proper professional, and it's not advocating for them to come to our law firm or accounting firm, but really it's the old adage of a penny wise and a pound foolish. In order to navigate this landscape, I think it's incredibly important that landlords are very careful, especially if you're in California, to make the right decisions and to get right counsel in order to actually just run their business, to earn a living these days. You know, to do it on your own, to do it in a solo practice. Maybe that client in my example earlier made a good call, left the state and bought triple nets in another state and just washed their hands of it. That could have been the great move.
It could be. And, at the end of the day, it all boils down to your tolerance for trouble, right? If you're a triple net, you're not going to have a lot of trouble.
That's right.
If you're renting Section 8 housing in the city of Los Angeles,
Yeah.
you can count on a lot of trouble.
Yeah. Well, I'm out. So we have a lot to say about California tenant law, and I think that it's ever evolving. We'll probably end up talking about this again. I'm pretty sure of it.
Oh, I'm sure.
So for our listeners, I want to say thank you for joining us. If you have any questions, comments, shoot us an email at podcast@taxis.com. We really appreciate you guys listening to us. Like, subscribe, give us comments. Until next time.